I'm Richard Morgan, the founder of Chief Disruptor Defence. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on the rise and fall of the British Army, which we are delivering in partnership with the UK Reserve Forces Association. Before we start, I'll just briefly cover a few admin points. After me, you'll hear from Major General Greg Smith. He will then hand over to Brigadier Ben Barry, who will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll go on to Q&A. I will now hand over to Major General Greg Smith.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Just by way of introduction, many of you will know me, and we've known each other for many, many years. But tonight I'm wearing my Chair of United Kingdom Reserve Forces Association hat, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes just telling you a little bit about where UKRFE is, where we're heading, and why the strategic context really matters, and why membership and seeing you all here this evening is really important, why membership is now central to our future. As you all know, UKRFA has long provided three things particularly well: international engagement, enabling professional development, particularly in an international context for serving reservists, and providing an independent voice for reservists. We've done this alongside defence, but independently of it, which gives us credibility, reach, and flexibility that defence alone cannot always achieve. And we've delivered this consistently through our volunteers, through our networks, and with particularly low overheads as well. But the environment has changed, and reservists are no longer simply a supporting activity. They're now central to mobilisation, to resilience and deterrence. Across NATO, there is growing emphasis on societal resilience. In fact, any of you who listen to commentary, and particularly the events of the last few weeks, will have heard that message repeated again and again. And some concerns being expressed that this country, along with its peer, or with its peer against its peers, is slightly falling behind. There is a need to emphasise civil-military integration and stronger peer-to-peer reservist relationships. And again, this is a first for us tonight, but some of you may have heard a podcast that we issued earlier in the year, where I was talking with my counterpart in Germany, Colonel Patrick Sensberg, who runs the German equivalent of the UKRFA, talking about what they are doing in terms of reserves and growing their reserve forces and so on and so forth. So that is happening, particularly over the in the European countries, particularly in the northern part of Europe, as many of you know. Now, at the same time, the changing role of the Reserve Force and Cadets Associations in the UK creates a real need for us to preserve a coherent, credible and independent reservist voice. And that's what UKRFA is all about. I think the opportunity for us, and the one that the trustees of the UKRFA have firmly seized, is that we need to evolve our organisation into an organisation that connects, represents and develops the wider reservist community in support of defence. So that's our strategic ambition. That's where we're headed. There are lots of things that we're doing along the way, and I haven't got time to talk about them this evening. But one of them is that membership really matters, and better communication with our members and with that wider network is something that we're putting more and more emphasis on. So how can you help? I think firstly, a simple ask: champion and support UKRFA and our new network that we're calling One Reserve. So use your voice, use your networks, your experience to encourage engagement, membership and momentum for us. Secondly, help us build that network. We need people, we need ideas, we need access, and we need practical support that I know many of you are very capable of delivering to shape a truly national reservist network. And finally, use your influence help defence recognise UKRFA as a strategic force for good, as a strategic force multiplier for resilience, mobilisation and reserve advocacy. So please join in. Please join our events, and say this one this evening is the first of, I hope, a number that we will be doing. Please come to our conference, which is this year on Saturday, the 3rd of October in central London, details of which will be coming out towards the end of this month in our latest newsletter. And then also volunteer to help. If you want to join in, please get in touch with me or get in touch with UKRFA. You can find our contact details in the chat and in the correspondence associated with this particular event. We are looking for new trustees as well, additional trustees to join in. So if you feel you're interested in that, or you know someone who might be, please get in touch. So with that, on that final note, thank you again very much for your patience, and thank you for coming this evening. And let's move on to the main event. So may I, on behalf of UKRFA and in support of Chief Disruptor, who are helping us with this evening, introduce Brigadier Ben Barry, well known to many of us. And Ben, we're looking forward to now hearing what you've got to say based on your most recent, very, very interesting read, The Rise and Fall of the British Army, 1975 to 2025. Ben.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to talk to you all. I served in that period up till 2010. I learned a great deal, encouraged, educated by many inspiring regular and reserve people. I had some great adventures on training and operations, making great friends. And my second career in the IISS kept me in touch with the Army. So this book's a history of the Army as a whole. It's a story of many great achievements, pardon me, often on difficult and complicated missions. Some Army histories read like love letters. I'm more of a critical friend, identifying many successes, but also failures. Praise and blame is allocated, and some names are named. Next slide, please. Okay, between 1975 and 2025, Britain's enemies and friends and society, technology, and the character of conflict changed greatly. So the Army changed a great deal. It's a story of contraction, combat, change, and continuity. It's called Rise and Fall because the half century saw the Army's fighting power grow to a high point, followed by a high plateau and then a decline. A country can have any number of defence policies, but if its forces can't or won't fight, the money is wasted. And from Bosnia onwards, our army encountered other armies who wouldn't fight or whose governments wouldn't let them fight. But this army has always thirsted for adventure, action, and combat to scatter our enemies and frustrate their knavish tricks, to quote the unfashionable second verse of the national anthem. And I found frustrating enemy knavish tricks in Belfast and Bosnia very rewarding. I say quite a bit on reserves in the book, principally in the Cold War, but I'm conscious that I don't say enough about reserves after the Cold War. But I do show the Army, including reserves, adapting and innovating. Many initiatives were successful, but sometimes the Army failed to change quickly enough. Next slide, please. Okay, this was a larger, different army. Compared with today, it smoked and drank more, was less fit, and could show sexism, racism, and institutional homophobia. The army's main effort was defending northwest Germany from Warsaw Pact land and air forces. For this, it had a corps of 3 armoured and 1 infantry division. These were at very high readiness, achieved by a high level of collective training at battle group level in Canada, at brigade, division, and corps level. A level I don't think has ever been achieved since. Next slide, please. I analysed some major exercise in the 1980s when troops manoeuvred in some strength over the autumn West German countryside. And these tested plans, tactics, deployment, logistics, and commanders. There was real fog of war, friction and pressure. Lessons were learned and implemented. Now, the Territorial Army, the TA, was extremely well integrated into Army plans and training, with mobilisation and deployment often tested. The TA also provided most of the troops for home defence. seems to me this integration has greatly declined. So a case study is exercise Lionheart 84, where TA units mobilised at drill halls after work on a Friday, travelled by air, sea, land, rail and ferry to their battle positions, where most were complete on the Monday. So this really tested the TA. Almost 40,000 reserves, mostly TA, some 50% of the TA assigned to reinforce Germany, were deployed, as were 3,000 regular reserve volunteers. And TA units on their annual camps took full part in the exercise. So the 2nd Division, which had a regular brigade, but 2 reserve all-arms combat brigades and an engineer brigade, was well tested. The first week of the exercise saw the whole corps in defence, and 2 Div was on the receiving end of several hundred simulated enemy Spetsnaz attacks and almost 20 descents by parachute and heli-bomb forces. And for example, 5th Battalion, the Light Infantry, began the first week of the exercise defending key points aside the wooded hills of the Teutoburger Wald. After an enemy ground attack was defeated, the battalion cleared enemy from a village. In the 2nd week, the corps went on the offensive with 2 Div given a full sector to attack and boot the enemy out of. 5 Ally moved 60 miles by road overnight to relieve a regular battalion on the River Liner. After supporting an assault river crossing, it conducted a battle group wood clearance and was then joined by tanks to attack a village before the exercise ended and it returned to UK 2 weeks after it had been mobilised. Thanks to Vincent Connolly, I've analysed the Lionheart post-exercise report. And I'll just quote from it. TA units noticeably improved during their fortnight on the exercise. Any measure that will allow them training before general alert will pay great dividends. Now, there's a general sense from the report that TA combat units tended to be less well practiced and thus slower than their regular equivalents. And where there were direct regular and TA equivalent logistic units, such as transport squadrons, the TA couldn't produce the same output at the same work rate, at least during the course of the 2-week exercise, as could regulars. Now, of course, the Army senior leadership knew that a war that erupted with little or no notice would be a very demanding scenario for the whole Army, both regular and reserve. And I think the Army was ruthless about this, accepted that all soldiers, officers, units and formations would be severely tested, and not all would withstand the pressure. But in a longer warning scenario, if TA units had the opportunity to work up, the more effective they'd become before the bullets started flying. So if we can have the next slide. So this is a short summary of the main combat capabilities and combat support capabilities of 1st British Corps, and the TAs shown in yellow. So one point of interest is there's 2.5 complete combined arms brigades here, the 2 infantry brigades in 2 Division, and the parachute regiment group, a sort of demi-brigade that had 3 TA para-battalions with a specialist urban operations role. There was also stay-behind patrols from the HAC and the Corps Patrol Unit of the 2 SAS regiments, and there was a brigade's worth of close air defence. So could we see the next slide? Okay, this is the line of communication. The top part shows, it's the logistics also behind the forward divisional boundaries. So the top part shows the what's in the core rear area and core logistics. And then the second part shows the line of communication commanded jointly by RAF Germany and HQ BAOR. And there's a lot of medical units there. There's a lot of infantry battalions, and there are reserve engineer and signals brigades as well. The TA also had a major role in military home defence, providing most of the troops for this, including the Home Service Force. Now, this was done with the majority of Cold War units being on 30-man training days a year. So we can have the next slide. So there were Cold War experiments and innovations constantly during the Cold War. including the formation of a hybrid regular reserve infantry division, 2DIV, and the quiet revolution in battlefield logistics. And during the 1980s, fighting power considerably increased. General Sir Nigel Bagnall led tactical innovation and a revolution in doctrine and command, armoured warfare and operational manoeuvre. And the army benefited from the Thatcher government's rising defence budget, funding new weapons such as Challenger tanks, Warriors, and the MLRS rocket launcher. Next slide, please. Many troops from the regular army countered terrorism in Northern Ireland. In the early 1970s, inadequate tactics and strategy made things worse. But by the second half of the 70s, ends, ways and means were in better balance. There were many, many innovations during the campaign, which I describe in the book. And these and government and army strategic patience helped to bring that conflict to the end. And it's worth saying that throughout the Troubles, TA units in the province continued to train and deploy. Next slide. So the army determinedly rose to the unexpected challenge of the Falklands War, marching to the sound of the guns, and the army components of the Commando Brigade, the Parachute Regiment, the SAS, and the Scots Guards were the army's cutting edge. Although TA transport squadrons helped with very rapid outlay of the Commando Brigade's ammunition, there was no mobilisation of reserves, which moved at a stroke the Commando Brigade's petrol platoon. Some sappers and some specialists overcome this, but this was at no little risk. I take a critical view of the Army's provision of 5 Brigade as the second echelon formation. It was the least ready brigade in the Army with no organic logistics, but bizarrely, it was the National Strategic Reserve. Sending it to fight in such challenging circumstances where it nearly failed was the direct responsibility of the CGS of the day, General Bramall. So if we go to the next slide. So in 1990, the Army's at the height of its Cold War power. So we're on the cusp, we've reached the peak of the rise and we're now entering the plateau. In 90 and 91, it was tested by the unexpected mission Operation Granby to eject Iraqis from Kuwait. The Army's contribution was a considerable success, albeit with 3 armoured divisions having to be canalised to generate the single modernised division. Next slide, please. First Armoured Division quickly destroyed the Iraqi positions more quickly and with less casualties than anyone expected. Now, this was the high watermark of armoured manoeuvre warfare capability. I say much about armoured warfare, including in the Cold War, the utility of armour in both Iraq wars, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and in deterring Russia. The army that invented the tank and had 1,200 of these in 1990 will shortly have about 150. Next slide. So the logistics and deployment of getting the division of 30,000 troops, 6,000 vehicles, and 25,000 tons of supplies 400 kilometers east of where it landed, and then sustaining it over 300 kilometers of a fighting advance, was an amazing achievement by Army logisticians. Very different, but equally noteworthy as the amazing achievements of them in the Falklands War. It's not widely enough understood, but I would say the deployment challenges are but a small fraction of the deployment challenges that will be faced when the Army tried to deploy heavy forces from UK to Eastern Europe. But even with 34,000 troops in the Gulf, the Army still sustained its other commitments to NATO and Northern Ireland. Unlike the Falklands, the government allowed the mobilisation of reservists, but only medics. This worked, but there were many teething problems. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, the government was keen to realise a peace dividend, as indeed was the US governments and most NATO governments. The options for change defence reviews strengthened the conventional capabilities of the Army by about 1/3. The review was unashamedly a savings exercise, reducing the TA by a greater proportion than the regulars. The review itself didn't have much of a strategic rationale, so the purpose of the TA was not, I think, as clearly articulated as in the Cold War. But the review did at least create the headquarters of the ARC and its deployable signals brigade. In the first half of the 90s, there were experiments in using subunits of TA volunteers in the Falklands and Bosnia. And indeed, in 2003, when I commanded a brigade in Bosnia, my signal squadron was a mobilized TA signal squadron. In 1995, I took 20 volunteers from TA infantry units with me to Bosnia, half from the light infantry and green jackets and the other half from the TA parachute regiment. And almost all of them were people who felt that the war in Bosnia was an outrage and they ought to do their bit. I also took an excellent captain from 5LI, who was their ops officer, who became my assistant ops officer, but who often successfully stepped up the battalion's ops officer for sustained periods. Next slide. So the foundations laid down in the 1980s still underpin the Army's success in facing down brutal warlords in the unanticipated and difficult UN and NATO operations in Bosnia. So this is a photo I took in early 1996 of an operation we did to open a crossing point on the front line. And as you can see, it was really cold. Now, I took this from the upper floor of a trashed house, and below me, we'd set up a forward headquarters, which was being run by my ops officer, who was actually an officer of Royal Irish Home Service. And when I went down after I'd taken the photo, I looked at him, and he was a huge, great rugby playing Ulsterman. And he was shivering, which was very unusual. It was the first time I'd seen him shivering in the whole of the dark, cold winter. So I said to him, "Ross, you're shivering. Are you cold?" And he said, "Colonel, I'm colder than the testicles of a very cold snail crawling across a frozen lake. In fact, the last time I knew I had testicles was 24 hours ago." So the 1998 Strategic Defence Review resulted in the Army reorganising to better conduct expeditionary and joint operations, but it was never adequately funded by the unsympathetic Chancellor Gordon Brown. General Guthrie, then Chief of the Defence Staff, wrote in his memoir that, and I'll read this out, "This was not the first time, nor was it the last, that I had to cross swords with Gordon Brown. We got off to a bad start. It was clear soon enough that Brown would not fund what had been previously agreed. When I went to see him in 11 Downing Street, he paid no attention to what I told him. It was not long before he interrupted and said with a smirk, 'General, I do know a bit about defence, you know.' I gave him a hard look and replied, 'Chancellor, you know fuck all about defence.' His face turned red and his jaw slackened." Now, Guthrie goes on to say that he genuinely felt that the armed forces and the Army in particular suffered because of the damaging clashes between Blair and Brown at the time. He said that if he raised the topic of funding with Blair, he would look distinctly uneasy and say, "Well, you need to take that up with Gordon." The net result was that George Robertson, the Defence Secretary, had to settle for £500 million a year less than he asked for to fund the SDR. And I think this illustrates, as does last week's events, that defence only prospers when prime ministers compel chancellors to fund it. Now, I have a guilty secret, is that between 1998 and 2003, I was responsible for Army Reserves policy. Firstly, as the Deputy Director of the Army Staff, and then as the Director, being Secretary and then Chair of the Army Reserves Committee. In this 5 years, I visited a TA unit on average every month on drill nights, weekends and camps. And I was also advised by two great TA colonels, Simon Layla and Julian Radcliffe. Now, the 1998 SDR sought to grow the regular army by over 3,000 people to increase expeditionary engineers, signals and logistics. So it greatly reduced the size of the TA in order to redeploy regular permanent staff to the regular army, as well as cutting costs. So what it did was to focus most combat support, logistics and medical capability on supporting a fully mobilised ARC. I don't recall a clear rationale for much of the TA infantry and yeomanry, other than generating volunteers for operations. I observed in this period that many TA leaders, the red tabs and some commanding officers and long-serving majors didn't like this. I often heard remarks like, "Well, I joined the TA to help in a war of national survival, not this." And I don't think that either the regular army or the territorial army's leadership did a convincing job of convincing people that the world had changed. Now, in the Army Reserves Committee, our main effort was to improve the TA's readiness, particularly focused on the requirement to generate at 30 days' notice 4 field hospitals and 4 infantry battalions to support the hospitals. This was much harder work than it needed to be, in part because of intense suspicions from the regular infantry, but also because the Royal Army Medical Corps as a whole had insufficient readiness. But the TA medics mobilised for Telic in 2003 did well, as I'm told did the TA field hospitals mobilised for the long tail of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, after 9/11, I led the land resilience work of the SDR New Chapter. My team and I learned a great deal from the role of the US Army National Guard as the 4th Emergency Service. We also invented the idea of the Civil Contingency Reaction Force and the Joint Regional LOs, and secured some extra posts and training days for this. Now, during this time, I saw a lot of the TA, with many great people giving me many positive impressions. You know, twice a citizen had real meaning, but, and this reflects my personal view, at the time, there was a huge range of readiness in units. Some were very ready, others were pretty unready, and they seemed to be reluctant to have the necessary uncomfortable conversations about readiness and mobilisation with their people. I also felt that the Army, in recruiting and retaining TA people, should recognise that they were fighting a war for spare time. And I'm not sure many people agree with me on that. The TA had a thriving partnership with the US Army National Guard, but I felt from what I saw, there was a lot to learn from the US Army Reserve, which is more like the TA was than the National Guard, and Dutch and Canadian Army Reserves, although it was very difficult to persuade senior leaders about this. So next slide, please. So in 1999, NATO started bombing Serbia. The Army rapidly deployed HQ Arc and armoured and logistic brigades to Macedonia in readiness to become the Kosovo stabilisation force after any ceasefire. Now, they planned in conditions of great secrecy for a British-led corps-level ground attack on Kosovo and Serbia, and that would have required a full British division and deployment of many reserve logisticians and medics. I was actually called off leave to lead the mobilisation planning for that. Fortunately, Milosevic blinked first and Serb forces withdrew, supervised by KFOR. NATO command and control caused great friction, not least when General Jackson refused to obey a dangerous NATO order to confront Russian troops at Pristina airfield, telling his superior, US General Wes Clark, that I'm not going to start World War III for you. And in Sierra Leone, a rapid deployment to evacuate civilians from the war-torn country was masterminded in an intentional act of mission creep by then Brigadier David Richards into a defeat of the bloodthirsty RUF rebels that were on the cusp of defeating the Sierra Leone and UN troops. And after a daring hostage rescue mission by the SAS and Parachute Regiment, a long-term British mission rebuilt the country's army over the next decade. So the army played the leading role in setting up ISAF in Kabul and in Basra. With regard to the attack on Iraq, Optelic, initially the plan was for the British division to go in through Turkey from the north. And that would have required a road line of communication to the forward assembly area, possibly 2.5 times as long as the line of communication in Iraq. And the planning the army did for that would have required the mobilization of all the TA logistic units. But the idea was eventually dropped because the Turkish government was against it. So in sorry, can I have the next slide? So in 2003, the army masterminded a 21st century smart siege that captured the city without turning it into the rubble. And it then went on to have a brigade in Basra. The 100,000 strong regular army could just about sustain these commitments, partly because of the reduction of violence in Northern Ireland, but deployment in Helmand became problematic. So this period from 91 to 2003 was a high plateau of military achievement, which gave the army justified self-confidence. But I saw overconfidence and complacency sometimes in the army, MOD, and government. And I was sometimes guilty of this myself. So we then get 2 decades of descent from this peak of operational effectiveness for both regulars and reserves. Next slide, please. So a secret defence review over 2003-04 cut the defence budget and armed forces. Blair tolerated this. A consequence was the lack of helicopters to support troops in Afghanistan. Now, it's worth saying that those 4 years, 2006-2009, saw the highest level of operational commitment faced by the army since the relatively shorter peak of the Northern Ireland campaign. It was also the army's first experience of fighting an unpopular war since the Suez Crisis. The army was bent well beyond its design limits, but somehow it didn't break. Now, I imagine the reserves contributed to that. And completing the Iraqi mission while building up in Afghanistan was a major achievement. And doing all this and simply prevailing and soldiering on, despite indifferent government and MOD strategic leadership, was true testimony to the army's resilience. It took a certain amount of bloody-minded, obdurate satisfaction to get through that period, possibly the most challenging years of the army since the defeats of the early years of the Second World War. I analysed the army's operations in Helmand up to 2014, but I deliberately continued the story of Helmand until the final defeat of the West by the Taliban. Now, stabilisation in both countries saw increasing misalignment between ends, ways and means. Strategic failure resulted. Who's responsible? Well, Blair, Brown and the rapidly rotating cast of defence ministers, and also some senior leaders in the MOD. But the army was sometimes guilty of over-optimism and moving too slowly. There were many tactical successes, but from the viewpoint of 2025, cumulatively, both wars saw more failures than successes. The 2008 economic crisis led to defence cuts by David Cameron's coalition government, again reducing the army's strength and capabilities by another third. Afterwards, there have been further cuts to the army's budget and numbers, and botched equipment procurements, of which the Ajax scout vehicle is just the latest example, also ate at the budget. Next slide, please. So this was concurrent with 2 challenges to morale, retention and recruiting. The first comes from what I describe as crap contracts, with contractualisation of recruiting and maintenance of barracks and quarters, both contracts that serially failed to perform, underperformance that appeared tolerated by the MOD and the Treasury. Now, a positive thing is I saw female soldiers and officers in action as pilots and in cutting-edge roles in Northern Ireland, in intelligence and covert operations. I'd also seen that, of course, back in the 80s, there was a bizarre anomaly that women were allowed to have roles in home defence infantry battalions, which they couldn't have in NATO-rolled infantry battalions. So I welcomed the removal of restrictions on women's roles in the army, and I was delighted to see women, for example, passing P Company, and the lady on the right went on to serve as a platoon commander in a parachute battalion. So I found reports of sexual harassment of female personnel truly shocking, particularly how some male instructors at Sandhurst and Larkhill lost their moral compasses. And I asked myself, if it was so easy for that instructor to disobey rules in barracks, would he obey rules in battle, fighting to the death if required? So we're now on the final stretch of the decline. If we can have the next slide. So the integrated review had many innovative ideas, such as the Ranger Regiment, but further reduced army size and cut more combat capabilities, amazingly including the Warrior fighting vehicle that had such utility in previous wars, and no other NATO army lacked such capability. Now, the army had long told the MOD that of the 3 British services, it was the least modernised, And this inconvenient truth was now undeniable and was reinforced by the donation of army weapons and spare parts to Ukraine, including all its AS-90 artillery. Next slide. So I was really shocked by the 2024 Commons Defence Committee report, Ready for War, which strongly suggests the army had insufficient readiness, including ammunition, spare parts and medical capability, to rapidly deploy combat-capable units, not even for the role of the mooted reassurance force in Ukraine. And I see no evidence that in the 2 years since publication, any more ammo, spares and other combat supplies are in the army's warehouses and bunkers. And I wonder if the battle group in Estonia could fight for more than a week, let alone be successfully reinforced by a brigade with all its necessary supplies. Indeed, last month, an MOD official admitted to the Defence Committee that it cannot currently send to war a heavy brigade, let alone a division. And the sluggishness with which HMS Diamond meandered to Cyprus suggests two weaknesses. Firstly, dangerously slow or even amateurish decision-making in the MOD. And secondly, that our greatly shrunken Navy is possibly even less ready than the Army and is possibly too weak to repeat its successes in the Falklands War. Why has the Army shrunk so much? It's a lethal combination of ingrained Treasury hostility to defence spending and MOD favouring investment in ships and aircraft. And the greatly reduced land sector of the UK defence industry lacks the political support and influential lobbies of the shipbuilding and aerospace injuries. And since 1991, governments have been content with this, denying themselves many capabilities that previously had such utility. And many of those historic operations I talk about could not, with the state of the army as it is, be done now. Next slide. So I imagine this is familiar to you. And of course, you know, there was a lot that made sense in the Strategic Defence Review, and the announced modest increase to defence spending was welcome. But this mission is really, really challenging. In many respects, the sheer distance and the fact that when the reserve corps committed to battle, the situation may be very fluid, is much more demanding than what 1st British Corps was asked to do in the Cold War, albeit it's a smaller force. But to deliver it, in my judgment, requires a massive increase in readiness, particularly stockpiling ammunition and spares, rebuilding medical capability and restoring Cold War levels of training. My back-of-the-envelope calculation is it actually requires an army of 90,000 rather than 75,000. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't done the calculation for the necessary increase in the reserve, but I suspect it's even greater than that. So we're waiting to see what Dan Jarvis comes up with. But although there's been a lot of praise for John Healey, I was at the London Defence Conference at the end of April, where he openly said the UK Armed Forces is ready, and that the UK is safe. Now, defence experts, members of the armed forces attending the conference, were absolutely aghast at that. And Lord Robertson is right to say the UK is underprepared, underinsured, we're under attack, we're not safe, and that there are crises in logistics, engineering, cyber, ammunition, training, and medical resources. And the complete lack of civil defence means the UK population is not safe. So next slide. So there is some positives. There's an exciting new experimentation task force. Army Chief Rowley Walker has an ambitious vision for radical change, making use of advanced technology, and modernisation of some fighting equipment, including Challenger Boxer and new artillery, is funded. But important capability gaps remain. And this afternoon, I was absolutely aghast to read the weaknesses highlighted in the 2025 scrutiny team report. So without a significant injection of additional money, combined with ruthless pruning of the paralysing overgrowth of bureaucracy and red tape, I don't see how the decline in the Army's strength and fighting power can be reversed. Now, for the Army to succeed on operations and as a living, growing institution with healthy, regular reserve components, Well, it needs leadership and cooperation in Number 10, Whitehall, the MOD and Army HQ. It also requires the understanding and support of the British public. And there's only so much an old fart like me can do, other than try and encourage the excellent people who are in the regular and reserve armies and try and encourage them to soldier on in hope that a corner will be turned. So that's it. Round's complete. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. Quite a lot covered there. And a reminder that the recording of this session will be available afterwards for anyone who wishes to either listen on slower time or anyone who hasn't joined us this evening. So we'll now move on to the opportunity to pose any questions. So if you do have any questions for either Brigadier Ben Barry or Major General Greg Smith, now's your opportunity. You can do so using the Q&A icon at the top of your screens if you're using the Teams platform, or if you're using your browser and you're unable to do that, you can email them to defence@chiefdisruptor.com. And whilst we wait to see whether anyone has any questions, Ben, if I could just ask if anyone wishes to buy a copy of your book, available in all good bookshops, or is there another route you would recommend they go?
Well, Amazon's slightly cheaper.
Right.
And there is bookshop.org. I'd also strongly invite people to support independent local bookshops. And there are copies at the National Army Museum and another number of other museums like the Soldiers for Oxfordshire and the RLC Museum.
Okay, great. So a number
But it's also
there.
on Kindle and Audible.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So it doesn't look like we've got any questions that have come in. So it seems that you've covered everything that anyone needed answering. So that does mean that gives us the opportunity to finish on time. Just before we do finish, either Ben or Greg, would you like to say anything else before we finish?
If I can just come back in, Richard, and just thank Ben on behalf of the UKRFA for firstly this evening and actually taking us on that fascinating tour of, I know a number of people like me will remember those days. So that was a bit of a tour of a career that I had as an Army Reservist from the early 80s through to the mid-20-teens, which I was hugely privileged and fortunate to have done. And I remember to this day being a platoon commander on exercise Lionheart in 1984, which seems as fresh today in my mind as it as other things. So it was fascinating, a fascinating time, and really interesting. I think the lessons that Ben has highlighted. Ben, I was interested in your observations about the United States, and particularly paying attention to the Army Reserve. I enjoyed when I was, and I don't want to make this a lamp swinging series of comments, but certainly when I was in the Army headquarters as the head of the Army Reserve, the head of the TA, I think in those days, I had some really profitable exchanges with my Oppo, who was a 3-star reservist who worked in logistics for Procter & Gamble in his day job. But Jack Stoltz and I spent quite a lot of time together, not only celebrating the mutual centenaries of our organizations, but also in sharing our experiences. And as you said, at that time, 2008, 7, 8, 9, we were, I think at any one time we had about 1,000 reservists deployed on either Telek or Herrick, and the balance changed towards Herrick towards the end of that period. And the United States and their reserves, Army Reserves, were doing very similar things. So we were at war together, as well as being able to share our ideas and thoughts and experiences of what was going on behind. And I think we still have a lot to learn, not only from the Army Reserve in the United States, but also National Guard. But the United States Army Reserve, I think, particularly overlooked at one stage. And then finally, if I look back from where we sit today, and begin to look forward to what we really probably do need, particularly as my earlier comment said, as the strategic situation, if one wants to look at the sort of the bleakest end of the scale, goes, my goodness, we aren't ready. You've talked about the excellent work of the RFCA external scrutiny team, and their most recent report. It highlights, along with other commentators, the real gaps that we've got in the reserve that we have to address and address with alarming speed. And we are way behind where some of our peer nations are in northwestern Europe, particularly. So we do need to do a huge amount more, despite the best efforts of those that are currently serving in the senior parts of the Army Reserves. So interesting times. And Ben, I'm very, very grateful to you for your comments. Don't know whether you want to come back on any of that.
Well, I can think of three short points. The first thing is, I've set it out in my book, but I don't think people are aware just how close tens of thousands of reserves came to being mobilised for Operation B- for Kosovo, which would have proceeded if Milosevic hadn't backed down, or indeed if the northern option had been used in Telic 1, which, because of the extended line of communication, would have required all the army, all the TA's logistics. My second point is what I didn't cover in the talk was the Army's battles against viruses, foot and mouth, Ebola in Sierra Leone, and COVID, which used a lot of reserve help. Now, we're overdue another virus attack that requires mobilisation of regulars and reserves. What do I think the nightmare scenario is? The nightmare scenario is that by accident or in escalation, a NATO-Russia war breaks out. The UK has no meaningful civil defence. Now, there's a lot of evidence about civil defence from Second World War and from the Iran-Iraq War, where both sides bombarded each other's cities. And that shows that if you've got elementary civil defence warning, and you've got designated shelters and a small-scale organisation, you can cut civilian casualties by 50%, which, of course, the UK can't do against missile or drone attack because it doesn't have civil defence. So what would then happen is an enormous cry for someone to improvise civil defence. And I suspect they'd turn to the regular army and the reserves and the mixed regular reserve resilience organisation to set it up, but at very short notice. I'm sorry to be so optimistic.
Yeah, and if you, I don't wish to, well, there's no reason why we shouldn't advertise other people's interesting work, but anybody who's listened to Deborah Haynes's exciting podcast with some very experienced actors in it, will perhaps have some insights into what that doomsday scenario could look like, as an inadvertent escalation that could suddenly kick things off, and I think we'd be falling very short. And I do remember the B- operation, or the B- option. I remember I was right at the end of my time in command, and my time in command was characterized by being the last commanding officer of a fine Green Jacket battalion, because we were all reorganized in 1998, 1989, and in that, I think it was probably about May or June of 1989, being put in a car and taken to Aldershot to read the secret orders for trying to then work out how we were going to do the B- option with a battalion that actually we had pretty much just taken to bits. But Anyway, fortunately, we didn't need to do that, but just goes to show we do need to be ready, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very good.
We just had one question that's come in, so we'll just do that quickly before
Brilliant.
I wrap up. So a question from Joseph Chiveo, who asks, could you please suggest practical ways of improving recruitment and retention of regular and reserve forces? And he says he's particularly interested in the angle of Commonwealth personnel. Any thoughts on that from the period in question?
Okay, well, for reserve, I'll just concentrate on reserves initially. For reserves, you're in a war for spare time, which didn't exist when most of these 1940s drill halls were built. You know, multiplex cinemas, PlayStation, excellent municipal leisure centres, and lots more double income families. And I think, you know, that the regular army and the reserves need to see that, which they were I think they're in denial of during my involvement 25 years ago. But you've got the reserves have one competitive advantage over Special Constable, St John's Ambulance, British Red Cross, and a lot of other volunteer organisations, is the salary and the bounty. None of your competitors have this, and many of them, you know, require many of the other competitors you've got to pay for. So whether that competitive advantage is being exploited enough by the reserves, I don't know. There's two other points. The first one is you could greatly expand the reserves if you compelled ex-regulars to serve in them. Indeed, if you go back to the original 1978 book by Sir John Hackett, The Third World War, which is a future history in which NATO and the UK rearmed, there's actually a very plausible essay about how the reserves were doubled in size and also used in roles they then didn't have, like providing formed tank regiments. And that was all based on compulsory service for veterans in reserves for, say, their first 3 years. The other thing you could do for the regular army, which would then roll on into the reserves, is have a Foreign Legion. I've seen the French Foreign Legion, great strength, some weaknesses, but it works. It'd be very easy to do. And the only difficulty is, of course, in post-Brexit Britain, whether you dangle the carrot of, after whatever the minimum regular service was, British citizenship for yourself and your loved ones. But whenever I was serving and mentioned this to senior members of the army, they changed the subject pretty quickly, and it wasn't a welcome suggestion. But things are now so desperate that desperate remedies should be considered, I think. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
Ben, I absolutely agree with what Ben has been saying, and I mean, I'll just add to it. Ben did mention the chapter of army recruitment being contractorized to Capita in the, I think it started about 2014 or 15 or something, and I hesitate to say that I'm still deeply concerned and depressed by the way that seems to be working, even though it's now with a new contractor, relatively new contractor, who I understand is still working to a spec that was written in 2017. And for those that look at the date in the bottom right-hand corner of their screens, will see that we're now on 2026, and the world has moved on apace. I agree with what Ben is saying about the need that we have to fight for people's discretionary time. The world in that sense has also changed. I don't think we've changed our mindset and our thinking around this. I know very senior members of the army and other reserves understand this and think this, but to try and get that ingrained in systems doesn't work or isn't working, and we've got to change that. We've got to take the friction out of that. We've got to make this a really compelling and interesting opportunity for people. That hasn't changed. That was what we were trying to do in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s and so on. But we've got to make it appropriate to today and tomorrow's reservists. And my final point is just on Joseph, and thank you, Joseph, for your interesting question. Really great. Is actually how do we are a broad church, as the late great reservist Richard Holmes used to say all the time. It's one of the wonderful strengths of the reserves is that we're a hugely broad church. We can slice through the reserves, and we are society writ large. And British society is now very different to, as we all know, to how it was in the past. But we still need to be reflective of that, and having more Commonwealth people serving in the reserves and making them welcome into it is something we should continually try to do. And so bring it on, and we, my goodness, don't half need them. So thank you for your great question.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you to our speakers tonight, and thank you to the audience for joining us this evening. The question is a very interesting segue into tomorrow evening's webinar that we're running with the Army's Personnel Directorate, aimed at principally at serving reservists, but others are welcome, where we are going to be covering the key issues, opportunities, and actions that have been agreed to support improving the inflow of both new and regular to reserve applicants into the Army Reserve. So if you wish to join us for that and you're not yet registered, then register via the Chief Disruptor website, and look forward to seeing some of you on that. And then, as Greg also mentioned, look out for details of the UK Reserve Forces Conference due to take place on Saturday, the 3rd of October. See you then. Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Richard. Take care.
Bye. Bye.